Hi, I'm William Saunders. I'm director of the Catholic University's program in human rights, and this um, discussion is being brought to you by the Institute for Human Ecology. Joining us today is my good friend and prolific author, Robert Royal. Um, we want to talk particularly about his new book, but let me just tell you, Bob is the president of the Faith and Reason Institute, as well as the editor-in-chief of the Catholic Thing, which is a web page. I encourage you all to visit that web page regularly. Bob aims for a daily kind of op-ed of about 950 words or something to kind of start the day off on various topics related to Catholic faith, faith and reason. So it's thecatholicthing.org. Pretty easy to find. Um, so welcome, Bob. Glad to have you.
Good to be with you, Bill.
Today, I want to talk about with Bob, and we're going to get to questions. And anybody listening, feel free to ask questions. It's hard to judge whether anybody in the audience is aware of what we're going to talk about today, and that's one of the things we'll talk about. Is why you might not be aware of some of these things. But Bob's written a new book here, which is in the notes for this event, and it's The Martyrs of the New Millennium, the Global Persecution of Christians in the 21st Century. Now, I have to tell you that Bob has written another book before this, which was a great book and looked not at just the first part of this century, but the persecution of Christians over time. I don't have the name right in front of me, Bob. Remind us of the name of that first book.
Yeah, that one is the Catholic Martyrs of the 20th century. So I'm
Oh, so
following the centuries along here.
yeah, I just remember when it came out, when that book came out, and for listeners, I've worked with Bob for many years, and I was doing a lot of work in Sudan with the Catholic Church, and some of our pictures made its way into that former book, which was a great book. And I used to, if any readers may remember, there's a book called the Black Book of Communism, which tries to record all the people killed by communism. And if it is a black book, and the first edition anyway of Bob's book, it may have been pre-publication, but it was a white book, a white cover. And I used to tell people there was the black book, and then there's the white book of the persecution of Christians in the 20th century. But anyway, I recommend to you all, that's a great book, but we'll talk about this one today. I want to start off, if I can, by reading a couple of quotes. One is from Bob's book, and this is by Pope Francis. So, quoting him, today there are many martyrs. There are more martyrs than at the beginning of the church's life, and martyrs are everywhere. Today's church is rich in martyrs. It is irrigated by their blood, which is the seed of new Christians, quoting Tertullian, and ensures growth and fruitfulness for the people of God. The martyrs are not, quote, holy men, end quote, but men and women in flesh and blood who, as Revelation says, quote, washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb, end quote, quoting the book of Revelation. So that's Pope Francis' perspective on what's going on here. Remember, the subtitle of Bob's book is The Global Persecution of Christians in the 21st Century. And now I'd like to read you another quote from our current pontiff, Leo the 14th. This is from his audience with the members of the diplomatic corps who are accredited to the Vatican. This is from January. And it's a good, it's a great reflection. I urge you to read it, but I want to call your attention just a couple of things he says in it. And he talks about, due to various forces and things, in a similar way, I'm quoting him, religious freedom risks being curtailed. As Benedict the 16th recalled, This is the first of all human rights because it expresses the most fundamental reality of the person. The most recent data show that violations of religious freedom are on the rise, and 64% of the world's population suffers serious violations. It cannot be overlooked that the persecution of Christians remains one of the most widespread human rights crises today, affecting over 380 million believers worldwide. They suffer high or extreme levels of discrimination, violence, and oppression because of their faith. This phenomenon impinges on approximately 1 in 7 Christians globally, and it worsened in 2025 due to various factors. Sadly, all of this demonstrates that religious freedom is considered in many contexts more of a privilege than a fundamental human right. One last part of his quote of his statement: at the same time, we must not forget a subtle form of religious discrimination against Christians is spreading even in countries where Christians are in the majority, such as Europe and the Americas. There, they are sometimes restricted in their ability to proclaim the truths of the gospel for political or ideological reasons, especially when they defend the dignity of the weakest, the unborn, refugees, migrants, or to promote the family. So I just wanted to read that to the listeners to be aware of the Pontiffs, and as I just quoted, he referred to Benedict XVI. And we'll talk in a minute about what John Paul II had to say about the martyrs. So I think it's fair to say an emphasis of our last four popes, not counting John Paul I, who died after 11 days, but of the four popes who served for a longer period of time, this has been one of their emphases. So it makes Bob's book very timely. Okay, that's enough of me. I'll start letting Bob talk, but I just wanted to give you a context for this conversation. And Bob's book begins with what's called an introduction, but it's really more than that. It's a great reflection on this whole question of martyrdom. So Bob, we've got people listening, presumably some who know something about this subject, but maybe some who are just, this is a new thing. They don't know anything about how would you like to help orient them into this?
Well, I think what we ought to say to start with is a lot of people believe that martyrdom is something of the past, and usually of the far past. We all remember that there were early martyrs in the church, in the Roman Colosseum. Christians were thrown to the lions, etc. But it is not the case that martyrdom was only at that period. It's been a phenomenon of Christianity wherever it goes, because of course Christianity challenges people in their cultures and in the way they behave personally, and so it raises a lot of opposition wherever it goes. And Jesus said, "They hated me, and they will hate you." It's almost kind of a gospel principle to expect that people where Christians are going to be opposed. Now, in modern times, there's two books that I wrote that you're talking about, Bill. We've seen a shift, though, in how martyrdom has taken place in the modern world. I mean, there was the great period of missionary work when the New World was discovered and Europe went out into the far reaches of the world. But in the last century, in the 20th century, we had the totalitarianisms of communism, Nazism, and fascism, which produced enormous numbers of martyrs. And if it's true, I've had people tell me that I've said, although I've never said this, that there were more martyrs in the 20th century than in any other century. If that's true, it's because of the totalitarians. China, as you know very well, Bill, China and other places have really cracked down on Christianity in itself, and then also as a Western kind of religion that they don't like. But that's continued in the 21st century. The thing that has changed, and you can see this in my two books, By the way, the first book was written for the Jubilee year of 2000, and I gave a copy of that to John Paul II on May 7, 2000. Pope Francis wanted to have a similar celebration of the martyrs of the 21st century in May of 2025, but he died before we were able to do it, so we weren't able to reproduce it. But there are some plans in Rome to try to bring this to people's attention. But in the 21st century, as we know, things have changed. Communism fell, fascism fell, and Nazism fell. Now, what we have largely around the world are two major producers of martyrdom. One is Islamic radicalism, and I think we've got to say this point blank. And of course, not all Muslims are radical. Of course, not all Muslims are murderous and trying to destroy Christians. But Islamic radicalism has produced a number of martyrs in the 21st century, and particularly in Nigeria, as you well know. And the other element, which Leo was touching on there is this kind of woke anti-Christianity that is part and parcel of what we have in the West. But in addition to that, there's this criminality. I shock people a lot of times when I tell them that the most dangerous country to be a Catholic priest in at this moment is Mexico. Mexico, strongly Catholic, almost entirely Catholic country, is dangerous for priests because the cartels, the human traffickers, the drug traffickers, just the ordinary criminals, often cross swords with a local priest or a bishop because they're trying to stop the exploitation of a local people. So over the last several years, the largest number of Catholic priests killed in the world have been in Mexico. So it's a strange new moment, isn't it? I mean, it's a strange thing to think about, but it's a worldwide thing. And that's why I kind of began with Mexico, which is a shocking thing, but then went on to the other places like Africa, Asia, Middle East that you expect.
Again, sorry, but I think of the people listening, that probably, I doubt that any of them knew that. Any of them, I doubt that. I doubt I knew that. I knew about the extent of, and we talk about it more about what's going on in Nigeria, but I didn't realize what you had said about how dangerous it was for prelates in Mexico. I do remember, I don't remember how many years ago, when the cardinal was murdered at the airport. So I know it's dangerous for priests, but I think I think it's a good time for us to talk about it because there was just this strike by the Mexican government, aided by the Trump administration, to kill the leader of the largest, apparently, and most dangerous cartel in the world in Mexico. And that's been in the news, so people may be aware of that. So maybe talk a little bit more about Mexico, like a little bit of its history. I mean, I know you and I know a lot about this, but I'm just not sure average Catholics do.
Yeah. Well, the first chapter in my 2000 book talks about the suppression, out and out suppression of the church by the Mexican government, which was a socialist government. I mean, it was a really, even prior to the Soviet Union, it was a really militant socialist government that really tried to restrict the church, close down churches, persecute bishops. There are even novels. Graham Greene's The Power and the Glory is about a priest who's being chased by the Mexican authorities in Mexico back during that oppression. So that was the first place. And some people know about the Cristero War, which was a fighting back by Catholic lay people against their own government, which eventually led to a certain loosening. But it's only to recent times that even a priest can go out dressed as a priest in Mexico. So it's a strange thing for us in North America to think about that. But there has been this anti-clerical, anti-Catholic element in Mexico. By the way, that cardinal in Guadalajara, I met with him. I was in Guadalajara, I think it was about 1998. And I was down there giving a lecture for Serra International. They're a group that promotes vocations globally. And some people put me together with him. We had breakfast. He was a terrific man. And he was shot coming out of the airport. He's wearing clericals. People say that he was mistaken for another cartel leader. And I think that what had happened actually was he had found out some dirt about the connection of the criminals with the Carlos Salina government, which was then in power in Mexico. So if you ask me, that's the most likely explanation. But there are similar, less notorious things that go on, as I said earlier, because of the way the priests um, cross swords with these criminals. And we're seeing, because we've already seen increasing cartel activity in terms of human trafficking and drug trafficking, it's not a surprise.
No, no. Let's mention a couple other places. Just again, I'm trying and hoping that people may have heard something about some of these countries. Probably let's go to um, to China, and I think that's in the news enough that people may be aware of it, and they are likely to have heard the name of Jimmy Lai. Why don't you talk to us a little bit about uh, the persecution or violence against Christians in China?
Yeah. Well, as I think probably everybody listening knows, China is still a communist state. It has managed to somehow combine fairly dynamic economics with total party control. So this is something new. This is not like the Soviet Union, where they basically wrecked what economy in existence in Russia and in Eastern Europe. The communist Chinese have managed their country in a much more sophisticated way that's enabled it to be productive and to be militarily powerful. So, to begin with, you've got a communist regime there. And what we know is that when communism came into power in China back in the 40s and 50s, they really struck hard against Catholics and other Christians in China, of whom there were quite a few, by the way. And there were some very good books that were written at the time about what was going on in China. I like the remark of there was a Marian bishop, American, who talked about the persecution in China at the time, and he said, Christianity is like dynamite. He said, if you bring it into a certain situation, you should expect some explosions. And I think this is in a contemporary way reflecting what Jesus said when he says, they persecuted me, they will persecute you. Now, recently, the Chinese signed what is still a secret agreement with the Vatican. I'm very disturbed about this because we know that at least 10 bishops in China have simply disappeared. We don't know what's happened to them. They could be being held. They could be being brainwashed. They could be dead. But that's 10 bishops. And at the same time, although there should have been some kind of arrangement with the Vatican for the appointing of new bishops, the Chinese have gone ahead and appointed bishops on their own, which of course just violates the Catholic Church's understanding of what its own theological status is, that the churches should be able to be in communion with Rome. It is not. There are two churches, basically, two Catholic churches in China. There's the Patriotic Church, which is controlled by the government. And then there's the underground church, which has remained faithful to Rome. And, there's a lot of back and forth between those two. But there's a lot of tension. And the communist regime is trying to do what they call Sinicizing all religion. In other words, it becomes Chinese in character, and it becomes even more subservient to the Chinese Communist Party. And that is just a fact of life right now.
Yeah, as you know, Bob, we have a Center for Human Rights here at Catholic University where we do the bulk of our work about human rights connected with denial of the same by the Chinese Communist Party and efforts to undermine human rights in other countries. But yeah, I just mentioned that to underscore what you're saying. And now is a time of increasing restriction on the church, not lessening restrictions. There's more, Chairman Xi, from my perspective, seems to be trying to consolidate more and more power. And as a lot of people like that, they become more and more paranoid, I think, and like Joseph Stalin, and he is trying to make the Catholic Church almost an organ for the Communist Party. where even the gospel is recast, the pictures on the wall, the hymns that are sung. You have to register if you're going to go to church. If you register, of course, they got you. Um, then, this is a great surveillance state. So I think it's an intense place where religious freedom is denied, and it's an ideological totalitarian state, which is the enemy of human freedom, human rights, religious freedom.
You mentioned Jimmy Lai before. I didn't get around to him. And I think a lot of people who are probably following us here know that name. Jimmy was a genius of a businessman. He came to Hong Kong, I think, from Shanghai or Singapore with nothing in his pockets at like 7 years old. He built up a garment business that he made a lot of money at. He opened a newspaper, so he was a publisher of a democratic newspaper in Hong Kong, and he's a Catholic convert. And I think that his case, probably more than any other, because we know a lot about what has happened with him, shows what is happening with the repression in China. So he's a Catholic. He's a British citizen and who's living in Hong Kong. The government begins to crack down on him and on his pro-democracy activity via his newspaper, which I think was called Apple Daily, if I remember
Yeah.
this right.
Right.
And he could have fled. He could have easily fled to England because he's a British citizen. But he chose to stay, I think, for two reasons. Partly because he believed, because of his Catholic faith, that every single human being is born in the image and likeness of God. He's talked about this. And that therefore the governmental and social and cultural institutions that exist in the world have to respect that basic understanding that we are all, in a sense, connected with the Creator and cannot simply be bossed around by a regime, especially an illegal regime. So for all that, of course, he's spent now, 5 years, I think, in jail. He was just recently condemned to 20 years in jail for anti-Chinese activity, which, of course, is just, it's a kangaroo court that's drummed up these charges that have absolutely no basis. I mean, what he did actually was something that you might applaud in another circumstance. But he's in jail, and I've just been talking with his family recently, and we're hoping that what they might do is expel him because his health is not good. If they were to expel him, send him back to England, maybe he would survive. But a 20-year sentence for a man who's already in his late 70s is basically a death sentence.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Yes. I think Jimmy Lai saw his mistreatment by the communists as a chance to give witness to the faith, and I think he succeeded. There are so many people who have become aware, um, but it's time to let him leave, and I'm hopeful that the Communist Party will realize that's something that maybe the Trump administration would appreciate, and they will let it happen. So I hope it does happen. It's a pretty vicious regime. Um, I mean, Jimmy Lai was taken to court, in chains. I mean, ludicrous. I mean, he's an older man. He's in chains, his feet and his hands chained as if he's some kind of terrorist who's going to blow up the court. And this kind of sentence is a death sentence. 20 years at his age means he would never get out. But it really illustrates the power of these totalitarian regimes and their fear of religious freedom. Um, I'm sure many people have read the books like 1984 that look to a dystopian future, and that is what is happening in these regimes. Um, they're using AI and they're using cameras and they're using facial recognition and body recognition, and it's becoming extremely intense totalitarian state. And the enemy of any totalitarianism, right, is a belief in a higher authority, which by definition, if you're a religious person, God is a higher authority than the state. I think in your book, you make the point that these ideological and totalitarian regimes are one of the big persecutors, as we were talking about. Um, Another country we mentioned just a minute ago, I'd like to for you to say a few words for, because people may have heard about this, is Nigeria. I think people may have heard that the Trump administration had designated Nigeria as a country of particular concern, and there had actually been a bombing during the Christmas season of a headquarters of some terrorists, Islamic terrorists. Um, but for those who don't know much more than that, Bob, maybe you could tell them a little bit about what's going on in Nigeria.
Yeah, well, we mentioned earlier that Mexico is the most dangerous place to be a Catholic priest, and just in terms of sheer numbers of those who are killed in Mexico year after year. Nigeria is the place that produces the most Christian martyrs year after year, and it's numbers in the thousands year after year. It's a little hard to get precise data because a lot of these places are out of the way and things are not recorded, and there are kind of massacres that people don't even know who escapes, who goes to another place, but we know that the numbers are in the thousands. Nigeria is the largest population, has the largest population in all of Africa. It's about 250 million. It's actually a wealthy country in terms of mineral deposits. So it has oil and it has rare earths and it has other things. So there's a certain amount of disordered scrambling, for that physical wealth. But I think we need to make some distinctions here, because even in Rome, sometimes you hear cardinals or popes saying that in Nigeria it's not a religious clash. Well, in some instances it is, economic exploitation. In some instances it is just different ethnic groups that are clashing with one another. It's sometimes explained that there is a clash between Muslim cattle herders and Christian farmers who are competing for the same land. The cattle herders want to be able to graze, the Christian farmers want to be able to grow. But there also is a religious element here of people who are dying. There's a radicalism that migrated from the Middle East, from ISIS, into all of Central Africa. You see it in the Democratic Republic of Congo. You see it in Sudan. You see it in some other places there, and even in Asia. So I wouldn't discount that there are other elements playing out in Nigeria, but there also is this clash, and it's a clash for a particular reason, because of those 250 million people in Nigeria, it's almost exactly half split between Christian and Muslim. So in the northern states where the Muslims predominate, there are often these massacres, churches are burned, schools are attacked. I mean, I think we've all seen these cases where entire schools are kidnapped and held for ransom. A couple of Catholic schools recently have been entirely kidnapped. A teacher, along with teachers, people are killed along the way, or they're forced into slavery, Islamic slavery. So it's a complicated situation, but we want to keep in mind that we have a tendency, of course, in the West to try to explain everything according to economics or power struggles. There also is a religious ideology, a radical Islamism, and they openly profess they want a caliphate in West Africa. But they're part of an international movement that is trying to create a caliphate in Africa. And that you rightly say, I mean, the Trump administration brought back the designation of country of particular concern, CPC, which the Biden administration, for some strange reason, suspended about Nigeria. But they're back on that list, and they belong on that list until that government gets a grip and gets control over the more radical Islamic elements in Nigeria.
Yeah. So I think we have gotten a couple of questions. I'll start to get to them and work them into our conversation. But I think it's interesting what you said. We don't know why the Biden administration took them off the list, but I think it alludes to a bigger problem, which you talk about some, and Pope Leo talked about, which is the idea somehow that Christians, whereas we accept that you could hate all kinds of groups and they could be victims, somehow Christians are never targeted. And do you want to say a word about that? And I think it's what Leo was alluding to, particularly in the West, and particularly in the modern kind of countries?
Yeah, I think part of the reason for that is that our media generally are progressive. They look at the church as regressive. Here in the United States, our bishops, Catholic bishops, commissioned a study of attacks on the church, anti-Catholic acts, and they found that over about a 4-year period, there were almost 500 church arsons, vandalism, statues, thrown down, just attacks within churches. So it's quite a bit even here in the United States. I work with a group that's located in Vienna, in Austria. It's an observatory on anti-Christian behavior in Europe, and they use Europe's definitions of hate crimes. I mean, so this is an official definition by the European Union, the EU. They use those definitions, and they claim that there are over 1,000 anti-Christian hate crimes throughout Europe on a yearly basis recently. And this is not reported on for a couple of reasons. Partly in Europe, at least, it's because I think people recognize that a lot of these are being carried out by fundamentalist Islamic groups, and they're a little bit worried about stirring up tensions with these new groups, which have been growing because of immigration to Europe. I think, as I said earlier, there also is a tendency among progressive journalists to kind of look away and say, well, Christians. If Muslims were being harmed, I think we would see a much greater outrage if it was done in a systematic way, the way we see it happening to Christians. And in the African circumstance, I think also, I'm sorry to say this, I think that there's a kind of a passive racism. I think that people just kind of say, well, it's Central Africa. It's always violent there. The governments are incompetent. No, I say that we believe in the dignity of everyone, and that means the dignity of people, even in poor countries, to expect just fundamental respect of human rights, particularly religious rights. As you were saying at the beginning, Bill, I mean, in a way, if you think about it, religious liberty has to be the most fundamental right, because your relationship to ultimate reality, to God himself, if that doesn't take precedence over everything else, if that's not respected, who's going to respect the other rights? No one.
Right. And the state becomes totalitarian just necessarily. There's nothing that can challenge the authority of the state. Bob, let me just bring in one of these questions. And one of them is, what is right around the corner? I mean, given all the study you've done, where is it that, we're afraid that it might burst out next, Christian Catholic persecution, where it hasn't bubbled into that yet, but it could be right around the corner. I don't know if if there's a particular country or countries you want to draw our attention to that maybe we could act proactively in advance on.
Well, as I was saying earlier, I think that this massive Muslim immigration, and I think the Vatican is misreading the situation. They should recognize that, yes, we want to be open to people from other cultures, but the way that this massive immigration, mostly young men, unmarried men, to Germany, to France, and to the UK they're now presenting cultural clashes that are extremely worrisome. You can see in the UK, for example, there's this notorious case of these Pakistani grooming gangs that were ignored over years and years and years by the police because they didn't want to create a conflict, a social conflict with a Pakistani group. The French are a little bit better at this. They're a little bit tougher on extremist groups of both the right and the left, by the way. But they're losing, according to their own government statistics, there are 2 religious buildings every month that are destroyed in some fashion or other in France. So I think those 2 countries, they're really at the boiling point. There's no telling where they're going to go. And it could just be a very simple thing that could set off who knows what kind of social clashes. Germany.
I mean, it does. You go ahead, Bob.
Yeah, I mean, just to finish off this idea, Germany has a lot of knife attacks. I hear from friends who are living in Germany, especially women, they won't dare even go out at night in major cities. So you just can't have these kind of cultural clashes. You can wish that there would be integration and acculturation of people arriving in new countries. But when there's such a cultural disparity and there's such a religious disparity, I mean, I don't want to single out Muslims because not all Muslims are problematic, but I think you want to be careful and take into account all the different aspects of these situations because we can see that there are pressures building in Scandinavia now that they're cutting back extremely on this immigration from Africa and the Middle East precisely because of what it's starting to do to their society.
I've got another question here, Bob. What role should the Catholic Church or should it play both at the local level and Vatican level to respond to this persecution?
Well, I
I
mean,
mean,
first of
yeah.
all, I think they should respond. It's not the case. It's great if a pope mentions this or a bishop mentions it, but we should be constantly aware that our fellow brothers and sisters in Christ are under pressure in many places around the world. I mean, you think of a place like North Korea where Christianity is basically just suppressed. I mean, we don't even know what's happening in North Korea because it's so dominated by that communist regime that even to get information, although we've heard about some terrible things when Christians are captured there. I mean, we don't even know what's happening in such places. There are countries where blasphemy laws are applied, in Pakistan, for example, and in some other places. In the Philippines, there are some radical Islamic elements. So, look, we need to talk about this. I've written 2 books in 25 years, and that's great, but we should be talking about this a great deal. If we truly believe in human rights, and you've been working on this, Bill, more than anybody over decades, if we truly believe that human rights are universal rights, we cannot neglect the fact of Christian rights. And I think some Christian leaders are afraid that they're going to be looked at as crybabies, always claiming that Christians are being persecuted. Well, they are. And there are ways to talk about this that are convincing and are simply statements of truth. And they should be constantly being spoken about, not only among ourselves, but you have to go out to the more secular areas. When my first book came out, I convinced the woman who was the editor of the Washington Post Book World. They used to have a thing called the Book World back then. It was a different Washington Post back then, too. But I used to write some reviews for them. And at first, she was reluctant to review my book. And then I said to her, look, this isn't just an inside Catholic question. This is a truth about what happened in the 20th century, even in secular terms. So there are ways to talk about these things. And eventually they did review my book. There are ways to talk about these things to insert it into a larger discourse about human rights, dignity of human beings, as our popes and our bishops like to talk about, that isn't just our own crybaby, Catholics being persecuted. It's upholding a principle, even among people who don't particularly like Christians.
Yeah, Bob. And one thing I have to say historically is there was a certain blindness, particularly in the governmental bureaucratic kind of class, so that they would pay attention to anybody who was victimized. This is internationally, but not to Christians. Um, and some of it might have been hostility. It probably was, but some of it was just flat out uh, ignorance. And so I personally believe that as a Christian, you have obligations to other Christians. Read Dies Caritas Est by Benedict. That doesn't mean we don't have obligations to other people, but we have particular uh, intense obligations to members of our own faith. And I think particularly when it's ignored by the media, not everybody all the time, everywhere, but generally not paid enough attention to. How many sources have ever said what you've reported, about the level of persecution and violence in Nigeria? So there is a kind of blindness to it, and you almost cooperate in that blindness if you keep quiet. And also, I just want to emphasize what you said. Human rights absolutely recognizes religious freedom as one of the foundational human rights from the Universal Declaration onward. All international treaties recognize it. All these countries are bound by these treaties. They've signed them. You know, all you're doing is holding them to what they promised to do. And I would just say, if you're listening to this, you don't have to solve every country. You don't have to do anything. Pick a country where you're moved by what is happening to Catholics, and other Christians. Pick a country and then see what you can do. You can, as Bob said, talk to somebody else about it. Maybe you start some kind of reading group. Maybe you start a letter writing campaign. Maybe you get in touch with, the largest employer in that country, maybe is an American company, and you write to their board of directors, et cetera, et cetera. You don't have to do everything. You shouldn't feel helpless at all. And as Pope Francis said, the blood of the martyrs is also has in supernatural ways. It's it it it's it's used by God, brings good out of evil, is the way I would put it. Let me ask you another question, Bob. I got a question here that asks about two particular countries, and maybe you have something to say about those. Nicaragua and Myanmar. How bad is the situation in those two countries, in your opinion?
Well, I think it's quite bad. Like before I get to that, let me just add one other point.
Sure.
I think you're right to do absolutely whatever presents itself to you. I think you should do something. And I have to thank the group Aid to the Church in Need USA, which helps support the book that I wrote. They're very active. Now actually an advisor to the board of Aid to the Church in Need USA. And they and some other groups have been laboring in various places, Middle East, Ukraine, Africa, Latin America. There are organizations that people don't know about that you can actually make a difference by helping support them in their work to just get the word out. But they also do things like encourage people to move back to Syria. They try to rebuild villages, rebuild churches, rebuild schools, et cetera. It's not hopeless. There are good people who are working on these things at this point. But let me go back to Nicaragua and Myanmar. I don't know anything about Myanmar, so I won't comment on that. But Nicaragua is quite bad. I say in my book that there's a joke kind of circulating in Latin America in certain circles. I was just talking with a Nicaraguan woman the other day about this. And what people used to say when a country was kind of becoming socialistic is, they're going to turn into the next Cuba. Well, now what they say is, it's going to turn into the next Nicaragua, because Nicaragua has been through ups and downs over the last 40 years. They're basically ruled by a family, which claims to be a Marxist family, but it's like socialism within one family rather than within one country. It's Daniel Ortega and his wife. And their children, too, are also running various offices. They've been very repressive toward the church. They've closed radio and TV activities that the church has there. They've restricted priests and bishops to house arrest. They've even expelled them. I met a Nicaraguan bishop in Rome whose name I think is Rolando Alvarez, who was a very charismatic figure there and spoke out. And of course, they couldn't tolerate him. So they had him in house arrest, and eventually the Vatican was able to work out a deal that they sent him to Rome, but he has to kind of now keep quiet, not be in the public eye. But he's a quiet witness to what's going on there. But it just goes to show you that even in these small countries that we think, are just run by kleptocracies or, people who are authoritarians of one kind or another, they have to go after the church. They have to, because the church will stand in their way. They don't dare kill so much outright the way that communists used to in Eastern Europe and in the Soviet Union, because it looks bad and they all need international support and whatnot. So they want to, not draw attention in that way. But boy, they can be very, very clever in the ways that they repress and then even expel people.
Uh, I Let me take a second, Bob. I want to go back to one thing in the introduction to your book, your introductory essay, which is really good. Uh, and you might remind us all. You reflect here in the essay, but remind us all about how do we know who is a saint. I think most people know if you're martyred, you're a saint, but how does one become a saint? Do you have to, I think you talk about the red and white martyrdom. Do you have to be killed to become a saint?
No, I mean, the church has always declared saints for other reason, people who've lived holy life. What has changed, um, I think it's worth saying, and I say it in that introduction, is that the church has broadened the way you define who's a martyr. When we think back to the Roman Empire, we think that it is Christians thrown to the lions, and we think it's a kind of a theological clash. It's very rarely a theological clash. You could say that in communism, it's an ideology as opposed to a Christian theology. But a lot of the time, what's going on can be, something different. So there's an old Latin phrase that they used to use, in odium fidei, somebody has been killed out of hatred for the faith. John Paul II and Pope Francis explained in modern terms some new things about what that could mean. Like I say again, it's not necessarily what we might call a theological difference. They say Pope John Paul II, Saint John Paul II, said that he called what he called the nuovi martyri, the new martyrs. These can be people who might be carrying out what we think of as a secular role, but they're doing it out of a religious commitment. So those priests who are killed in Mexico because they oppose the cartels, or say a priest who's killed, and there have been a couple of cases of this, or magistrates that are killed in Sicily when they're opposing the mafia.
Yep.
They're doing something that has a secular dimension. You're trying to keep somebody from being trafficked, or you're trying to keep the mob from controlling the water in a village in Sicily. It looks like it's a secular activity, but in fact, it's inspired by a religious commitment. So what John Paul II meant by nuovi martyri are these people who are killed in those kind of circumstances, and we can recognize that you can be carrying out a secular activity for a religious purpose, and therefore you're a martyr. Francis added another category, which he calls oblatio vitae, the offering of your life. And I think that he was encouraged to do this because in certain circumstances, particularly as Islamic radicalism started to emerge, there have been cases where, I'm thinking of a particular case in Lahore, Pakistan, where a man, a Catholic man outside of a church on, I think, Palm Sunday, sees an Islamic suicide bomber about to enter into the church, grabs her. She sets off the bomb, and both of them are killed, and there's other collateral damage, but it doesn't end up in the whole church being blown up. And so I think Francis wanted to point out that there are these circumstances where you offer your life on the spur of the moment. You weren't, opposing the mafia, the cartels over the course of your life, but on the spur of the moment, you decide out of your Catholic faith that you're going to prevent somebody from doing something against the church. And so he wanted to offer that, and he was a little ambiguous about whether that turns you into a martyr or a saint. But I think he wanted to register that there is this activity that is happening around the world right now. So, there's a deep root of what it means to be a martyr or a saint, but it also gets enriched a little bit, and it gets extended because of circumstances in the world right now. I think it's a very interesting development. And I tried to explain that in a clear way with some references, so you can actually go and look up the way these three stages have emerged.
So I want to say again for the people listening. So this is just a kind of brief introduction to Bob's book. I really encourage you all to get the book. It's organized with this really good introductory essay, and then takes certain parts of the world and reports on what's been happening in the first quarter of this century, um, ending with what's going on in the West. And again, I refer to you to what I read to you from Pope Leo about how even Pope Leo is recognizing what's happening in the West, where Christian witness for these other basic human rights, like the family or the right to life or others, are being because of that witness, Christians are being discriminated against, marginalized, and we hope not actively persecuted, but you never know what's going to happen. So, Bob, let me turn it over to you. We've got a few more minutes. If anybody has a question, please send it in. What would you like to say about the book or about the subject for those who listen to us now or watch this later?
Yeah, I suppose we could expand a little bit on that last point about in the West, because there's a look there is a what you could call a spiritual battle going on in the West. A lot of people think that what is secular is neutral. Well, ideally, what democracies in the West have tried to do is to allow for religious pluralism where people can live and let live alongside one another. They can disagree, but they can also participate in the public discourse. This is something I think that a lot of people now misunderstand, that somehow if you are a Christian or you're a Jew or you're a Muslim and you want to speak out in public, that it's illegitimate to do that. Well, that's absolutely ridiculous. That means that the only voices that can be expressed in public are secular voices. This means that religion does not have any standing in public, and we see that in some places there's indulgence of other views. And again, I'm going to go back to Europe and Islam. Islam is a militant religion. And even when it's not violent, we see in places like the UK that people are willing to assert themselves in public the way that I think Christians need to do if they're not going to simply be marginalized in the countries where they have historically been the majorities. This is not to say that we're the only people who ought to be able to speak in public. We have to make arguments because no one gets to impose his religion or his faith or his morals in public, but we have to make arguments. And unless we're willing to inform ourselves, and then being willing to, with proper charity and with rational and calm discourse, try to explain to people what we stand for. Unless we're willing to do that, the game is over. That it's either going to be secularism or it's going to be the radicals. So that's a program that I would propose to people. Learn about what's going on, and inform yourself, and be clear in your own mind that there is a spiritual battle that's always been going on. It doesn't have to be a violent battle, but it is going on. And unless Christians are willing to participate, you always say, Bill, if you don't show up for the game, you forfeit. So, you've got to show up for the game. And maybe you win today and maybe you lose tomorrow, but if you're not a participant, you can't complain about what happens to you or your children, your grandchildren. So be aware of it and realize what's at stake.
Yeah, speak up for your co-religionists. There's nothing wrong with that. I mean, I support human rights for all people, but I certainly am deeply touched when my co-religionists are being victimized around the world, and not many people are standing up for them. So be a voice for these people. Learn from Bob's book and other things. And if you're listening to us, you live in a liberal democracy, and you should thank God for it because you got the opportunity to speak. So many places in the world you can't speak. Here you can speak. And again, democracy is not perfect, but you have an opportunity that most of the world would give anything to have. I mean, I know from the people in China And I work with Chin Guangchen, the barefoot lawyer, and he's always told me for the people in China, America is a beacon because it has democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. So you have an opportunity that most of the world doesn't have. Use it.
Well said, Bill.
Bob, thanks a lot for being with us. I mean, I don't know. It's a great book. It's a great service you've done to religious freedom, but to Catholics around the world. So we thank you for it. We hope everybody that listened will share when this link comes out others, so that those who couldn't join us can catch it later. Thanks again, Bob.
My pleasure, Bill. Be well.